during a dive to the Titanic has so far not yielded any results. 5 people are on the 21-foot vessel called Titan. It's estimated the craft has enough oxygen until Thursday morning. CBS News correspondent Jared Hill has been telling LBC potential rescuers are facing the unknown.
This is at a depth at which at least the U.S. Navy has never done a rescue that deep, if it potentially is at the level of the Titanic. And so figuring out ways to get them out, get this up, is going to be one of the other big challenges, again, as they try and execute this search and rescue mission successfully.
A former chief medical officer has said sorry to relatives who lost loved ones during the COVID pandemic. Professor Dame Sally Davies was close to tears while giving evidence to the public inquiry earlier on today. The man accused of murdering 3 people and trying to kill 3 more in Nottingham last week has been given a trial date. Valdo Kalakani will enter a plea in September. The 19-year-old students Barnaby Webber and Grace O'Malley Kumar were killed, along with school caretaker Ian Coates. The head of the Metropolitan Police says well over 500 of his officers are on restricted duties as he tries to restore trust in the force. Sir Mark Rowley was put into the post almost a year ago after Dame Cressida Dick lost the confidence of London's mayor. He's told the newsagent's podcast the exact figure is changing every day.
I've said we need to get rid of hundreds of people. If you look back over the last few years, the Met has been sacking 50 people a year. So clearly the answer is going to be a lot more than that. So it's going to be hundreds of people we need to remove from the organisation who are a serious challenge, at the same time as creating a stronger, healthier, better trained organisation that's more resistant to this in the future.
And in sport, Australia have won the first Ashes test at Edgbaston, but it was close. They reached their target of 281 with 2 wickets to spare. The second match in the series is at Lord's next week. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 19 points at 75.69. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.16. LBC weather, rain with showers clearing for most of the UK tonight, although they will persist for Shetland and the far northwest with a low of 10. A mixture of sunny spells and scattered showers, which will be thundery in the northeast across the UK for tomorrow, and a high of 26 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Tim Daly.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. This is Cross Question.
Good evening, you're listening to LBC, it's 8:03, and I'm Ali Miraj, and you're listening to and watching Cross Question. Joining me on the panel this evening from my left are Mathew Hulbert, the former Lib Dem councillor, who is also a political commentator. Also to my left, Emma Revell, Head of Communications and Public Affairs at the Centre for Policy Studies think tank. On my right, Steve Reid, the Shadow Secretary of State for Justice. And further on the right there is Lord Stewart Jackson, a former MP and Conservative peer. You know what to do. There's lots of things you could ask about tonight. You might want to ask about what we've been discussing in the last hour about mortgages going up, also rents going up exponentially as well, the government not giving any help there. Also, Rishi Sunak being very coy about whether he actually agrees with the Privileges Committee report on Boris Johnson. George Osborne in front of the COVID inquiry again, giving the same message David Cameron gave about austerity actually being a benefit in COVID preparation, not the opposite. And also Elton John saying homophobia is on the rise. Or anything else that's on your mind, feel free to call 0345 6060973. You can text on 84850, or you can ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. And don't forget, you can watch us live on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question. Watch on Global Player. This is LBC.
So let's go to our first question from Malcolm in Bodmin. Malcolm, Nashweda.
Mr. Ali. Evening, Ali. Evening, panel. Panel, do you agree with me that a simple, elegant and perfect fix for the mortgage problem is for the banks to extend everybody's fixed mortgage for 1 year, if they have to, add some extra interest, a small amount, and for everybody on a mortgage, which is either a tracker or a base rate mortgage, that they should be given a 1 year fixed mortgage at a fair rate. That way, nobody loses money. The banks will not lose money because the money's already lent. It's a simple, elegant fix. Does the panel agree?
Okay, so does the panel agree the bank should be made to extend people's fixed terms by a year, eliminating increases people can't afford? Now, just as a way of background here, in the last hour we were discussing this, Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, has ruled out any direct state support to borrowers hit by surging interest rates. The Chancellor will be meeting with mortgage lenders later this week to ask them what support they can offer. Steve Reed.
Well, I agree with the premise of the question, which is that we do need to get the government round the table with the lenders and the regulators to look at what can be done to help people through a crisis which is not of their making. You know, people are facing horrific increases in their mortgages. You know, we'll all know people, friends, family members, ourselves, who are coming to the end of a fixed period or have got a standard variable rate, and the mortgage is going through the roof. You know, the average increase is going to be £2,900. Who could afford that at a time like this? But why has it happened? We have to say, why has it happened? You remember last October when the government had that absolutely catastrophic mini budget where they made tens of billions of pounds of unfunded spending commitments, cutting tax for the richest while raising taxes on everybody else without being able to say how they would cut those taxes in the first place. And it led to a massive run on the pound. It led to a collapse in investor confidence and the financial markets' confidence in the UK economy, forced up government borrowing, and that has led to an increase in interest rates, which is now baked into the system. So people are paying a Tory mortgage premium in these additional costs that they're facing. But we can't just sit back and let it happen to people. We do need to get people around the table with the lenders.
But Steve, but what you're saying is that getting people around the table is fine. I mean, Pat McFadden, your own Shadow Chief Secretary of the Treasury, also said, as you've alluded to, that it was a reckless economic gamble, this Liz Truss quasi-Quarteng budget. People are paying up to £7,000 a year extra on their mortgages for this. But if you were in government and you were faced with the situation that we have right now, would you intervene directly to help people with their mortgages?
Well, you would need to sit down with the lenders and with the regulators to work that through. I'm not going to just sit here and make up what I would do. That's the kind of thing quasi-Quarteng and Liz Truss would do, and I hope I'm a little more responsible. But underneath that, you do need a more stable economy. You know, we've got an economy that's failed to grow relative to our competitors for 13 years now. That's leading to higher inflation. It's led to wages falling in real terms over the past decade, and all of this has fueled the cost of living crisis. But after 13 years of failure, there's not a quick fix, I'm afraid, but we do need a government which will take us in a different direction.
Okay, Emma Revell.
Well, Jeremy Hunt has said that he will get around the table with mortgage lenders. I think he's planning to do that on Friday, so the government is already having those discussions. I don't think sort of direct intervention is the way to go. It's not something the government can afford, and it would be a very big benefit for a very concentrated number of people. Now, the 30% of people who have mortgages in Britain at the minute are struggling and are going to have those impacts, but they're going to filter through to renters as well. It's not something that renters are immune from. In fact, in many cases, renters are paying other people's mortgages anyway. So it's not something that you can necessarily expect the government to put their hand in their pocket and bail out, even though, you know, COVID and furlough and, you know, energy price caps have given people the impression that government can always step in and always have the money for these things. You know, that's not necessarily what the call of Malcolm is suggesting. He's suggesting, you know, the banks and other lenders come up with a scheme themselves.
Yes.
I think if mortgage lenders want to, you know, offer that kind of thing, they also have, you know, payment holidays, for example, and I think that the Chancellor will be asking them to consider how, you know, struggling to pay your mortgage may affect your credit rating, which is something people are particularly concerned about. They don't want to ask for a mortgage holiday because they think it'll impact them for later down the line. I think some reassurance around those kind of issues would help and assuage people's nerves.
I mean, what would you say to people who actually feel very hard done by that it was actually on the back of specific government decisions like the quasi-Quarteng Liz Truss mini-budget that actually caused at least part of it, if we're being charitable, of this increase in mortgage costs? Shouldn't the government actually bear some responsibility and therefore provide some help?
I think the government should bear responsibility for a failure to build housing over the you know, period of the Conservative government, but that's not just something that's happened since 2010. It's decades and decades long, and previous Labour governments and Conservative governments before them have just as much responsibility. The reason that this is so hard hitting at the minute is because house prices and therefore mortgages are so incredibly high, and actually if we don't tackle the underlying issues around supply of housing, this will continue to be a problem for, you know, decades to come.
Lord Jackson?
Well, look, Steve Reed's a smart guy, and he knows that, he regurgitates the Labour attack line about the budget last autumn. It's a bit simplistic to say that. Yeah, there were mistakes, of course, but actually the attempt to tackle issues around low productivity, deregulation, low taxes was a brave effort. And I think it's too soon to say whether it was a complete failure or not, because it may be a future Labour government needs to look at those issues. The fundamental issue, and I totally agree with the point made earlier about the housing market, we do have a dysfunctional mortgage market, but I think the main point is that the Bank of England has taken its eye off the ball for way too long about inflation, and the only weapon in the armoury now is inflation, is interest rates to deal with inflation. And I think the people that have been locked into what were hitherto very good fixed-term rates, 3 and 5 years, are now paying the price. Yes. So it's not just that period last autumn when Kwasi Kwarteng was Chancellor and Liz Truss was Prime Minister. It's a systemic failure, I think, of the Bank of England to keep a proper eye on inflation and have other ways.
You think they should have acted sooner and harder?
Absolutely. And, Andrew Bailey came before Treasury Select Committee on a number of occasions and really failed to address that issue. But we also need to build more houses. If we're going to have a functioning mortgage market and proper choice, we have to have an offer for young people. And the challenge for any government elected at the next general election is reform the planning system, make it easier to say yes. We have a relatively small amount of land on which we build in this country, but at the same time we have problems with immigration, for instance, finding enough houses for people. What's the offer to young people now? If you have to be aged 38 or 39 before you can afford a deposit, why wouldn't you be pretty fed up with all politicians? So I think it's a multifaceted problem. It's not just a question of
the point you're making there is a good one about the fact that we need to build more houses. Of course we do. Yeah. The greater supply will lead to less pressure on rising costs. So why has the government just scrapped house building targets? Because it's not going to happen if you're not going to make local areas get on and build the homes that we need.
Steve, I'm in danger of agreeing with you here. I think it's...
It's all happening on Cross Question tonight, isn't it?
It was inevitable, wasn't it?
It's an electoral cul-de-sac for my party, which was the party of home ownership, to go down the NIMBY route. And I think it's deeply, deeply regrettable because you can't create capitalists if they can't own capital.
Well, that was one of the issues that was arising in the last hour about how capitalism is itself under great pressure. But Steve, I've got to ask you this. Stewart, rather. So I've got to ask you this. One of the things, you said that you can't lay it all at the door of Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss, but the very markets that they worship, gave their verdict on that ridiculous mini-budget, didn't they?
Yes, and where I would agree with you, and I think you'd have to be churlish not to agree, was they didn't roll the pitch.
Yes.
They didn't get the agreement of the financial markets. Yep. They didn't fly a kite in the parliamentary party or the wider Conservative Party or in government and the civil service. Yep. I think they wanted to do too much too soon. And of course, the cut in top rate was probably the straw that broke the camel's back. Yep. So I do agree with that in that respect. But their prescriptions were not inherently wrong. They were just too soon.
Well, not cutting the 45p top rate?
I think they should have waited 6 months or 12 months to do that.
Okay, Matthew.
So, good evening. I think it's pretty shameful, actually, that Jeremy Hunt has ruled out direct government help. I think that is one of the things that should be considered. And, Emma says he wants to get round the table. Well, you don't get round the table having already ruled out a potentially major source of help to people who are really struggling at the moment, and people really are struggling. And yes, it might be the easy political point to make, to point to the Tories in that budget, but we also can't pretend it didn't happen. I mean, it was catastrophic. And, Liz Truss goes around now talking as if she's some great former Prime Minister. I don't know how she has the barefaced cheek or shame to show her face still. I mean, that budget was appalling. And so the party that made the problem should fix the problem. And part of that surely should be direct state intervention.
Well, just on that, Matthew, I mean, obviously you've been a Lib Dem councillor in the past and still very supportive.
Not an official spokesperson.
No, of course. But the Intermediary Mortgage Lenders Association actually rebuffed the idea that came out from your party, which was for a fund, which they were calling for, with grants of about £300 each for homeowners. And the Mortgage Lenders Association said this would be just completely ridiculous, unaffordable, and would not be sensible. And then the point that Emma was making is, I think, worth also considering. We've got 2.4 trillion of public debt in this country. Where on earth are we going to get the money from?
But governments can find money when they have to find money. And that cat was let out of the bag during the pandemic when money was needed to be found, and it was found. Now, I'm not saying that we build debt onto debt, pile debt onto debt.
Yes.
Of course we shouldn't do that. But all I'm saying is we shouldn't rule options out before even getting round the table. And I have to say, as a renter myself, we shouldn't forget renters either.
Absolutely.
We are really under the cosh at the moment.
I know. Emma, you were sort of reacting a little bit. We are 100% debt to GDP ratio in this country at the moment. I mean, how high should we go?
You say that governments can find money when they need to find money, and the furlough scheme is an example. But the more money you find in that way, the less you have the ability to find more, because your debt is increasing. If you don't want government to borrow and you don't want them to add to that, then the only way to raise this money is to add to general taxation, which will, be just as harmful as adding to people's mortgages.
But you accept that people are really suffering right now, I'm
a London renter. I understand that housing is a problem.
I would say I agree with Matthew about renters. And one thing that we've failed consistently, too much control by the Treasury in this country, Labour and Conservative, is leverage private sector monies, particularly pension funds, into good quality private sector rented sector.
Right.
If we did that, like they do in Germany and Canada, across Europe, we would break this sort of myth of home ownership and have the capacity to provide decent homes.
It's going to take a government prepared to take tough decisions to get homes built.
Understood.
And this government's just given up.
Absolutely. The house building issue constantly recurs. So you can see that our panel has already got off to a roaring start here. If you want to get your questions and you know what to do, 0345 60 60 973. You can text on 84850, or you can ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. You're watching Cross Question and listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 870.
This is LBC. Cross Question on LBC. Text 84850.
You're watching and listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:19. I'm joined by Mathew Hulbert from the Lib Dems, Emma Revell from the Centre for Policy Studies, Steve Reid, the Shadow Secretary of State for Justice, and Lord Stewart Jackson, the Conservative peer. Our next question comes from Ben in Clacton. Ben, good evening.
Good evening, Ali, and good evening, panel. My question is, what is the 225 abstentions, and including our Prime Minister, tell us about the modern-day Conservative Party?
Lord Jackson.
Well, I think there was a decision taken by many Conservative MPs that they didn't want to vote because they didn't think the process was fair, they didn't think due process was followed, and they thought the Privileges Committee was wrong. I don't think many people believed that Boris Johnson didn't mislead Parliament, but I think the key question in the 108 pages of the report was whether there was cut and dry demonstrable evidence that he did it knowingly. And I think that, I think probably people are sick to death with this issue, but broadly speaking, my concern, if I'd been in Parliament, I wouldn't have voted either, is that if you set yourself up as a quasi-judicial tribunal rather than a legislature, then you have to behave like a court of law and you have to observe legal niceties and legal process that goes back to Magna Carta in 1215. And many people thought that hadn't happened, even those that were not friendly with Boris Johnson. So I don't think it says anything about the Conservative Party. There's a lot of pompous stuff, self-reverential pompous stuff about the Privileges Committee. This is raw politics, what we saw yesterday. And I think now is the time to get on and talk about social care, the NHS, education, and the things that really matter to people rather than contemplating our own navel in Parliament.
Okay. Well, I mean, just on that particular point, Stewart, people would say that Boris Johnson himself signed off on the fact that Harriet Harman was going to chair it, something that people have forgotten, and he said he would abide by whatever the committee decided, and the committee has decided that he has deliberately misled. No one can argue with that. But the fact that Tory MPs not turning up in the debate, I mean, do you think it sends a positive message of where the party is right now?
No, I don't, and I don't know why he signed that off, and Harriet Harman made that point in Parliament yesterday. I do think that this will come back to haunt Labour. Once you start getting a position where you move into lawfare and you use a quasi-judicial process to chase out your opponents that you couldn't defeat at the ballot box, then I think that's very bad. And I did use the example when I wrote about this yesterday of Clinton in 1995, the Monica Lewinsky impeachment. It backfired on the Republicans and they lost in the election after that. And, it's about politics and debate. We shouldn't be entering into this really difficult situation where you're chasing your enemies down and trying to destroy them.
Steve Reed, it's going to haunt Labour.
Well, what it does is it undermines the very premise of parliamentary democracy if senior ministers, the Prime Minister no less, can stand up and deliberately lie to the House of Commons in order to cover up what they'd been doing on something as significant as this. The report says, remember, Tory majority on this committee,
yes,
all signed it off, Tory majority. They all signed this off. He was told he couldn't say the things that he said, and he said them anyway. It was deliberate lying to cover up what he'd been doing. And what he was doing, remember, was allowing parties to take place, knowing that parties were taking place during the lockdown, while the great British public across our country were making the most extraordinary sacrifices to keep other people safe and stop the spread of the virus. People missed their loved ones' funerals. We saw Her late Majesty the Queen in Westminster Abbey at the funeral of her husband of 70 years, sitting alone because she respected the rules. But Boris Johnson was above all that. He put himself above all of that and he lied. And we simply can't have that. Now, there's one thing that you said there that was right. My goodness, we need to move on. My goodness, we need to move on from the psychodrama that the Tories have inflicted on this country for years now. This hasn't only just happened, it's been going on again and again and again. And one very good way to have drawn a line under it last night, I thought, would be for Rishi Sunak to come out and vote in favour of this report to show that he was different to Prime Minister. You could put it as standing up for professionalism, integrity and accountability, couldn't you, if you wanted to? But instead, he decided to cower underneath his desk inside number 10 and leave it to others to do the work for him. This is a Prime Minister too weak to stand up to Johnson and his supporters on the Tory backbenches, and because of that, this psychodrama will continue until we finally get rid of this rotten government.
Psychodrama will continue. Matthew, what do you make of this?
So I think the Tories that didn't vote yesterday were pretty damn spineless, weren't they? I think deciding not to decide over something as important as our democracy and not lying at the dispatch box is pretty disgraceful. And I think it's a government that is turning into an opposition already by the day. I think their days are numbered. I think Sunak is weak and can't control his own backbenches. And I think it's time the rotten lot went.
And do you think that, do you actually think that there is any way back for the Tory party to actually restore its integrity? Or do you think this sends out such a bad message that so many of them... Penny Mordaunt, to be fair, Leader of the House, came out very clearly. She's saying it was going to endorse it, so did Theresa May, I think, as well. But so many didn't. You think it's curtains time?
But I think you've got to think that those two people that you've just mentioned there, who gave very good and very brave speeches yesterday, one of those, I'm not saying Leader of the House isn't important, but it's not one of the leading government roles, and the other is a former Prime Minister on the back benches. I mean, those in power in the party are driving it more and more to the reactionary right. I don't think Rishi Sunak himself is on the reactionary right, but I think he's too weak to have a word with those like Suella Braverman, who are on the reactionary right, and they're doing immense damage to our country that will only be resolved by a new government. I have to say to Steve Reid that I think Labour could be much braver and much bolder than it's being. I think Keir Starmer is that cautious he's constipated. I think we need bolder and braver a government, but someone needs to take some action.
Emma?
I think Boris Johnson himself took a lot of heat out of this vote by resigning. So, whether you voted for...
He jumped before he was pushed.
Well,
he ran away. As he always does.
I mean, he had already seen the results. He'd already seen the suspension.
And back then it wasn't apparently 90 days. Well, so we're led to believe it was a lot less than they upped it because...
It was presumably at least still quite chunky, and he clearly thought it was enough to decide to resign. I think for a lot of Conservative MPs who chose not to vote, that's possibly the reason why. They thought, well, this isn't as important as it would have been, because it doesn't change his relationship with Parliament in the same way as if it was a proper suspension. And, it was going to pass anyway. So I can understand why a few people stayed away.
Okay, well, let me ask you a follow-up question from Peter in Chippenham, which has come in via Alexa. We're having a chat about Alexa and Alexa's intrusion into our lives. And this question is this: should Boris Johnson's resignation honours list still be enacted? And I'll just give you the background here. The Lib Dems have asked for Johnson's entire list to be withdrawn after MPs voted to approve the report, finding he repeatedly lied to Parliament. We were just talking about that, and was part of a campaign of abuse and intimidation against the committee behind that report. And also, the Tory Work and Pension Secretary Mel Strider suggested that Sean Bailey's peerage could be reviewed. He was the mayoral candidate who was at that party which has come out over the weekend, that those appalling that video. Could be reviewed if he ends up being fined by the police for the jingle and mingle Christmas party exposed by the Mirror at the weekend. Matthew, what do you make of this?
Well, I keep thinking back, and I'm afraid this was on a radio station that wasn't LBC, but I'm sure we've all heard this.
There are no such radio stations.
Of that call into Any Answers, of that woman whose daughter took her own life and who they weren't able to get to. It some of the most powerful radio I've ever heard. The pain in her voice was palpable. And at the same time as she was having to suffer that, the Tories were partying in 10 Downing Street. I mean, we talk about it as if, it's just politics. It's disgraceful.
Yeah. So should the resignation honours be... I don't know if it can be practically now, because I think it's been passed.
I don't know if it can, but the fact that these people are likely to be sitting in our legislature for a lifetime, well, it's pretty shocking, isn't it?
Emma?
I think there's no reason to dismiss the list as a whole. As you say, it's been signed off, it's been approved and granted by the King. I think I do agree potentially with Mel Stride's suggestion that, if there are individuals on that list who are found guilty of infringements, there's probably a case in those circumstances to at least take a second look.
Including, no infringement made, but including a 29-year-old aide who had the most rapid ascent in political history, going from an intern to a baroness within 6 or 7 years.
Well, I think that's a different question. If you're the instance of Sean Bailey and the jingle and mingle, which is, by the way, the least appetising and appealing name for a party I've ever heard.
This is politics, isn't it? I mean, this is point scoring.
Go on.
Starmer put Tom Watson into the House of Lords, who apologised for his vile calumnies and lies about people and destroyed their lives.
Has Sean Bailey apologised?
But he has apologised.
Has he?
Yes, he has.
No, is this about standards and integrity in public life?
Let me just finish.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah.
And look, Tom Watson's apologised. I'm a fair person, and I think he's a contribution to make, particularly on the media and arts in the Lords. Sean Bailey has apologised, and I think there would be a bit of a constitutional issue here in embarrassing the King in rescinding either his or any of the others. Now, you have a valid judgment on what you think of those people, whether they're old enough and experienced. Fair enough. But, the Liberal Democrats put dozens, scores of people in during the coalition years in the House of Lords. Not all of them were particularly merited. Blair put hundreds in his time, in his 3 terms. So, let's have less hypocrisy about this. Reform the House of Lords. I think it's too big. And I think you should get rid of the bishops, actually. It's pretty radical. And I think if you don't turn up, you should not be able to sit in the Lords. But this sort of very micro point scoring,
I'm sure you're doing a brilliant job in the Lords.
Ali, thank you.
Yeah, no, indeed.
You're hired as my
Do you
After a peerage himself.
Steve, do you think the resignation honours should be scrapped?
I do. I think it's tainted. If you take Sean Bailey, for instance, the Prime Minister would have, the Prime Minister approved the list that Boris Johnson submitted, and then moments later we get that video knowing what was going on downstairs in Downing Street with the party for Sean Bailey's campaign team, which he was at, this so-called jingle and mingle event. Rishi Sunak knew that. He knew that was coming, and yet he allowed that man to be appointed to the House of Lords. This is a debased list that debases the whole principle of public honours. Where was the honour for people that actually deserve it? Where was the guy that invented the vaccine? Where was the chief medical officer that got us through the worst pandemic in living memory? Instead of that, we get the failed Tory candidate for Mayor of London, who was part of the partying troupe downstairs in the basement at number 10. Unacceptable.
Well, you heard that, unacceptable. Some different views on the panel. If you want to get a question into our panel, you know what to do. 0345 6060973. You can text on 84850. You can ask Alexa, who's already made one contribution to this programme already, to send a comment to LBC followed by your question. You're watching and listening to Cross Question on LBC at 8:31. The news headlines with Tim Daly.
The United States Coast Guard says the search for the submersible which went missing during a dive to the Titanic has so far not yielded any results. It's estimated the craft, called Titan, has enough oxygen until Thursday morning. The social media influencer Andrew Tate is to go on trial in Romania after being charged with offences, including human trafficking. He denies the allegations, as does his brother Tristan. And Australia have won the first Ashes test at Edgbaston. They reached their target of 281 with 2 wickets to spare. LBC weather, rain and showers clearing for most of the UK tonight, but they could persist for Shetland and the far northwest, an overnight low of 10 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question on LBC. Call 0345 6060973.
Welcome back to Cross Question. It's 8:35. I'm being joined by a really, really interesting and first-class panel this evening. Mathew Hulbert, the former Lib Dem councillor and political commentator. Mathew, very good to have you. I actually was on the way here. I actually got stuck on the tube, and I was thinking, what on earth would happen if I can't get out? And then I thought to myself, well, you used to be a radio presenter. You could have just taken over.
I was in local commercial radio for many years. I interviewed two prime ministers, Gordon Brown when he was prime minister, and David Cameron when he was leader of the opposition. Gordon Brown was not in a happy mood that day, but maybe it was just because I was interviewing him. And David Cameron was very, very charming, but I always say that his hair was that lacquered that if someone had lit a match, we all would have gone up in flames.
Indeed. I always find these hair comments rather non-inclusive. I just had my hair cut today. Those of you watching, you know the point. I'm follically challenged. I've said it before. Emma Revell, Head of Communications and Public Affairs at the Centre for Policy Studies. Emma, I find it interesting you did your dissertation on the place of religion in politics in the UK and the US.
I did. I compared how Tony Blair felt about his religion.
God.
Exactly, we don't do God. And then later on, is a bit more public about his Catholicism compared to, George Bush and the American inclination to say, God bless America at the end of every sentence going.
Fascinating. Steve Reed, the Shadow Justice Secretary as well. Steve, I noticed you grew up in St Albans. I went to school down the road from there. Beautiful part of the world, and that you also wanted to name and shame people when you were Lambeth councillor, users of recreational drugs. Is that right?
Well, no. Well, what happened there was, if you remember, Brian Paddock was the police commander there, and he announced he wasn't going to arrest people for buying cannabis on the street. So pretty much the whole of London came to Brixton to buy their drugs, and we had gangs fighting for the best pitches to sell. They were literally taking out knives and guns and killing kids on the streets. We had a number of youth homicides. So we had to do something to stop the idea that Brixton was open for the drugs trade. So we said, we will name and shame you if you come here, just because we don't want you to come. It was a specific thing to do to deal with a specific problem where you had that one decision fueling gang warfare on the streets of Brixton, terrifying local residents, closing down local businesses, kids being dead. We had to do something drastic, I'm afraid.
Absolutely. And Stewart, very good to have you here. The last time, I remember going back to about 2002 or 3, having a breakfast in a greasy spoon with you, discussing electoral tactics and what was happening in the world. Are you still enjoying politics now in the Lords rather than the Commons?
Well, it's quite a different place compared to. I always say compared to the Commons, it's quite a step change, really. And when you're finishing a second reading speech as a minister in the Commons, it's like a zoo. I mean, it's really brutal.
Yes.
In the Lords, it's like item 6 of the Bowls Club AGM. Everyone agrees with each other, and it's very convivial, but it's a bit more passive-aggressive. It's a bit different.
Very, very good stuff. OK, our next question is a text question from Sarah in Bromsgrove. 180,000 people have had their cancer tests and treatments delayed over the last decade because the NHS doesn't have enough staff. Why is cancer care going backwards? Now, a bit of background here. The charity Macmillan Cancer Support says delays in cancer testing and treatment across the UK has put 100,000 lives at risk since 2014. 180,000 people having their tests or treatment delayed. Understaffing was blamed for this. This applies to all parts of the UK, not just England. Emma.
Well, it's not just cancer treatment either. There are delays and waiting lists across the NHS.
7.4 million or something?
An incredible amount of people. And it's not just since 2014 either. It's, the COVID didn't help. Doctor strikes, unfortunately, don't help either. I think the NHS England said, a 4-day strike in April would delay something like 250,000 appointments, 250,000 people having cancellations. It's not an isolated incident. It's not, just cancer care, although, it's a particularly tragic area where you're suffering delays and the impact can be incredible. But it's not just about it's not at all, in my opinion, about a lack of funding in the NHS. It's about the way the NHS is structured, the way it spends its money, the way it allocates its resources. And there's not enough flexibility because the NHS is one centralised system. It can't incentivise doctors to go and work in a certain specialty or even a certain region if they're short of, oncologists somewhere specific. They can't say, you can have an extra, bonus or 10%. The NHS pay structure doesn't allow that kind of flexibility.
Yes.
So actually, some reform of the NHS,
Do you think we should pay? Do you you think we should spend more? We spend about the OECD average. We spend about whatever it is, 190 odd billion a year. Do you think we should spend more?
I think it's about spending the way we spend the money,
right.
And actually, more flexibility in, in commissioning, in pay, being able to incentivise people to work in certain regions, certain towns, certain specialties would actually really help in these kind of areas. But it's also about training, doctors and nurses for the long run. We can't magic these people out of thin air.
We do need a lot, and they're being attracted away to other countries as well. Steve?
Well, it is. I mean, what's happening in cancer is part of the bigger picture.
Yes.
As Emma's saying, 7.5 million people, isn't it?
Something
on
like that,
the waiting list. Now that's a record, and obviously the pandemic didn't help, but we were at record levels before the pandemic even hit, and that is the result of years of underfunding, I'm afraid, of the National Health Service, because inflation in health is higher than inflation generally, and we have an ageing population. So every year, more and more older people who are more vulnerable become more likely to become ill. And if you're not keeping pace with those, even if you keep maintaining the standard rate of inflation, then you're falling behind. And that's what started to happen. And the upshot of it now is almost 35,000, let me get it right, extra people a month now are having to wait longer than the 2-week maximum to go to see a specialist if they're diagnosed with having cancer. And you can just imagine the mental anguish if that was your loved one, if that was your child.
Well, there are appointments being cancelled on the day because there aren't enough staff.
It's unspeakable, and it is because of a shortage of staff, fundamentally, this point of it. There's a lot more we should do on using digital technology, moving towards prevention.
Keir Starmer's been talking about some of the reforms.
And it's absolutely right. We do need to reform it, fully accept that. But here and now, you need to do something to help these people immediately. And there's one thing that we could do, we put this forward, is if you scrapped the non-dom tax status, which is it's basically a tax loophole used by overseas billionaires who are residing in the UK but not British citizens, so don't have to pay tax, and they had to pay tax. It would generate enough money to fund 7,500 more doctors, 10,000 more nurses, the biggest workforce increase in the NHS's history, and that would be the means by which we start to tackle the waiting lists. But I'm absolutely not disagreeing with Emma in that we need to move towards prevention, digitisation, early intervention, all of that.
Matthew?
So the crisis in the NHS is very personal to me. It's coming up to a year on July 10th since my 78-year-old mum fell at home. We didn't move her because she said she'd hurt her ribs. We called for an ambulance at 5 a.m. and at 4 p.m, 11 hours later, an ambulance arrived. My mum was taken to hospital and she died 2 days later after an infection turned to sepsis. And so my view is that there is a serious crisis in the NHS, and I try not to be political about this because it is so personal, but I have to say to Lord Jackson and his party, when will they realise just how serious this issue is? People are literally dying as a result of the system being broken. Now, I happen to believe that it does involve more money, but it's not just more money. It needs genuine reform. I absolutely agree with Emma. And we need to finally recognise, somebody, that it's health and social care together that need to be fixed, and that we won't see an end to the problem until that happens. Because I can tell you, Ali, that the reason that the ambulance took so long to get to my mum was because ambulances were backed up outside a hospital in Leicester, and so the whole thing is connected. But for me, it's really, really personal, and I personally believe that this should be some kind of national emergency, actually, and that all parties need to get round the table to try and sort this situation out.
I mean, because the issue has been made that it's also about reform, not just money, and that is the nub of the issue. And we had a phone-in on this a few weeks ago where people were coming at all sorts of ideas, but it's a really difficult nut to crack. Stewart?
I agree with most of what's been said already. Any party has got to cope with the demographic change. The number of over 85s is going to double in the next 20 years. Yep. I do agree with Matthew, and I agree with Steve about communications. I agree with Matthew about social care, how important it was. Just after the 2015 election, I said to George Osborne, who was then Chancellor, you really need to give tax breaks for extra care facilities. So that elderly people are looked after from, say, their late 60s to their death, their nutrition, their health, because that way you would get rid of, inverted commas, bed blocking. You'd take the pressure off acute district hospitals. But can I just say one thing, Ali, that does concern me? You talk about doctor recruitment. Policy Exchange did a great report recently called Double Vision about this ridiculous idea of restricting the number of medical places to about 7,500 places. We've got 90,000 A-level students want to be doctors, and yet we're choking that off. And you think of those resources that are being wasted, those kids going abroad, doing other jobs. We've got to get that right, and I think we should be expanding that. And for the BMA, the trade union of the doctors, to say, no, we're defending our members' interest by keeping the numbers down, I think that's morally... Do you think we should give... we should actually pay the tuition fees for doctors? For the university tuition fees, to get more people in the system? Do you think we need to encourage more? I think we need a radical increase. We also need to be practical and say, do you really need, I know this might not be popular, do you really need a nurse to have a degree? Nurses don't need a degree. The government's been talking about apprenticeships again on that. Yeah, and I think that's important. But there's lots and lots of issues, and Matthew's right, it's across, it's above party politics. Yes. It is a national issue that we've all got to tackle. Absolutely. The NHS is a hugely important issue, and I think it's a very difficult, very, very difficult topic to deal with, because there's so many different elements to be brought in there. So you're hearing and watching our cross-question panel this evening. Lots of interesting topics being discussed, and you've still got 15 minutes to get your question in. 03456 60973. You can text on 84850. You can ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. You're watching and listening to Cross-Question on LBC. It's 8:45.
It's Colin Brazier on LBC.
Weeknights from 10.
Britain has lost control of legal migration.
Colin Brazier.
35 years in journalism have given me a nose to be suspicious.
On your radio.
My husband is not going to be with me much longer because he refused to control his type 2 diabetes.
On Global Player.
My own experience of helping to raise my 6 children, I would try and row him behind whatever the teacher was saying.
This is LBC. Cross Question on LBC.
You're listening and watching the Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:48. Just to about 10 minutes to get your questions in. Let's go to our next question from Hassan in Westminster. Good evening, Hassan.
Hi, Ali. Ali, my question is about the boat carrying more than 750 refugees which sank 45 miles from the coast of Greece. And we have 78 people confirmed dead, 500 people are still missing. This is literally 6 days after the event. Are we sort of failing our obligations to refugees by not offering more safe and legal routes?
I think it's a very interesting question. Stuart Jackson.
Well, the UNHCR actually has recorded us as being the second best country in Europe behind Sweden in terms of dealing with refugees in 2022. And even a person who isn't a Conservative would concede that in terms of bringing forward schemes, for instance, refugees from Hong Kong and, of course, Ukraine, we have done extremely well, and Syria, of course, a while back. There is obviously a very, very difficult problem, a crisis in Europe with immigration. We do need to work more closely together. Fundamentally, I've supported the illegal migration bill, which is now in the Lords, because I do believe you have to break the business model, inverted commas, evil people traffickers, and bringing people, children and women over from different parts of particularly sub-Saharan Africa to the UK. There's more to be done, of course. It is a tragedy, but governments need to work together. But I believe that the public is crying out for a bill to actually stop the boats and to try and resolve this issue.
But Stuart, what do you say to people who say that there are not enough safe and legal routes? How do you deal with that particular issue? Because you mentioned the Homes for Ukraine, there's also the Hong Kongers one, there's a limited one for Afghans as well. But there are lots of other countries in the world where people are legitimately fleeing persecution or war or famine or other things, civil unrest. What do you do in those situations?
I think the criticism of the government, of all governments, but this government, which has been in power a long time, of course, that it is not dealing with the bureaucracy of it, of the migration crisis to the extent it should. I mean, it shouldn't take months and months and months for asylum claims to be processed, and it is, and it is a crisis. And I just think we need to get the armed forces involved. We need to take it with the seriousness that we did with COVID, because it is impacting on our international reputation.
Steve.
Well, you mean you were asking about the boat in Greece? I think you're calling in particular.
Yeah.
And there is a lot more that we need to be doing to dealing with the problems at source that are making people want to leave their homes, their home country, their region, and travel so far to seek support. And I think we as an international community should be looking much more at what we can do collectively to deal with the problems that are leading to this. There's an awful lot more instability. We're seeing a lot more war. I think international institutions have become weaker over decades.
Climate change will also have an effect.
And climate change was the other one I was going to speak to there. If you live in a place where the land is now flooded, or it used to be arable, you used to be able to grow food there, now you can't because it's turned to desert, populations will move, and the slower we go at tackling climate change, the more that we will see this. Now there's no one country that can do this, in all honesty. It will take an international effort to deal with the problems at source, but in what we're seeing now, there are people smuggling gangs that are exploiting these highly vulnerable people, taking vast amounts of money off them, putting them on unseaworthy vessels in unacceptable numbers, and then we see people drown.
Yes.
And we have to be tackling those people as well. And I'm afraid, passing one bill after another, we're getting one every 9 months from this government, and then the situation on our own shores gets worse every time because it doesn't actually tackle the problem.
Steve,
to tackle a headline. We have to get serious about working
Steve, what would you do?
Internationally.
Because obviously you're talking about the issue at source, and I understand the point. But obviously Labour has condemned the Rwanda plan in no uncertain terms. But what would a Labour government do to address this issue? Because the numbers are going up every year.
Rwanda is just a headline-grabbing gimmick that has not stopped a single person illegally entering.
I mean, the Rwanda scheme hasn't started yet.
Absolutely. But it's cost vast amounts of money to deal with the problem, not at all. And even when it does happen, how many people are Rwanda actually? It just won't. It's gimmicks. We've got government by gimmick rather than the government prepared to put in the hard yards and get down and talk with our partners about how we really tackle this.
Okay, Emma.
I think we're failing by not tackling people smugglers. While this route is still available to people, and although it is a horrific route to take, it is still appealing because thousands of people are getting in boats every single year, every single week even. Until we can tackle that, and I think the way to tackle that is through things like the Rwanda scheme, making it very clear that if you do come here without the proper process through a legal route, and I think there should be legal routes set up. And I think the think tank where I work, the Centre for Policy Studies, has suggested that we set a cap for how many migrants the UK is willing to take each year, that should be voted on by Parliament, so there's democratic accountability there, with revisions for things like Ukraine, Hong Kong, situations like that.
There should be a cap. At least you're being open and honest. I mean, even Labour, I had Stephen Kinnikin the other day. I mean, even I asked him about the cap, and he was also accepting that there probably might have to be some sort of cap.
There should be a cap, but it also should be, very clear that if you don't arrive through a legal route, if you do, arrive in a boat, you will be sent to Rwanda. You will not have a chance of having your claim processed.
Do you know what, this government, they themselves have identified 16,000 immigrants who came here who they have identified as eligible for safe removal to a third country. Do you know how many of that 16,000 they've removed? 21. This is a government that is not acting when they even know what's going on. They're just not doing it.
The scheme's being held up.
So we clearly need more safe and legal routes. And I was thinking earlier today that so I'm a gay man, right? And in Uganda they've just introduced some of the most appalling and draconian anti-LGBT plus laws that are threatening the lives of gay people. And if I was a gay person in Uganda, I might well feel that I need to flee that country. I have to ask our Tory friend here, what safe and legal route could a gay person in Uganda whose life is under threat take to be able to come to the UK?
Stewart.
Well, the migration bill puts great store in judicial decisions to take into account that. For instance, in a way, it doesn't for people who are Christians who are persecuted in places like Tunisia and Algeria.
I'm a Christian too, by the way.
Right, yeah.
Christian and gay.
Yeah.
There you go.
Right, well, you would have a really tough time in some parts of Africa, of course. And I don't condone or support in any way that. Sure. And you're right, there needs to be a way to identify genuine folk who are in danger of real persecution and in fear of their life.
Okay. Right, let's go to our next question. It's a text question from Tommy in Dagenham. A businessman says men are afraid of working with women now in case they get accused of anything. Can men just not win in the workplace now? Now, this is John Allen, the former chair of Tesco, who says he fears concerns over tackling toxic behaviour in workplaces has left some men afraid of working with women. Emma.
Makes sense to come to me first. I'll take it. I think in some circumstances a little bit more caution on behalf of men thinking about what they're saying in the workplace to not just women, people who are subordinate to them in any way, wouldn't go amiss. Actually, a bit more thinking of actually could what I'm saying be misinterpreted? Is it an appropriate remark to be making in the workplace, especially to junior female colleagues? Is probably a good thing. I don't want too much nerves though, because what you will end up with then is senior men excluding women from conversations, from mentoring opportunities, and going back to a boys' club where bonuses and promotions are handed out on the golf course and women are back in the place they started from before.
That's a very interesting point about the boys' club. Matthew, what do you make of this?
So I think men have had it their stroke our own way for too long. And I think the movement that we've seen in recent years, the Me Too movement, has been really crucial. And women speaking out. And I think it's quite right that Emma spoke first, because actually men need to be listening to what women are saying on this, not just blabbing out stuff ourselves. And I feel that if men are feeling a bit hard done by, well, get over it, guys, improve your behaviour. And to other guys, including gay guys like me, if we see bad behaviour, we need to be calling it out and saying, come on, mate, this is not acceptable.
Indeed. Steve, obviously Parliament has had a lot of different sex scandals. I mean, hundreds of cases going on at any one point in time. So what do you make of this particular question in terms of how men should behave towards women in the workplace?
I think it's in every workplace. It's Parliament, every other workplace. Everyone should be treated with respect and dignity. And a good employer will make sure that is happening, and a bad employer will not be focusing on that and making sure that the culture works so that everyone's... a bad employer, that they also may not be paying them the minimum wage. They may be allowing discriminatory practice. Angela Rayner, my colleague, proposed a single enforcement organisation to make sure workers' rights can be enforced in any workplace, and perhaps we do. I think that's a sensible suggestion.
Sure. Stuart.
Good manners, decency, civility to everyone.
Yes.
I mean, I have an 18-year-old daughter,
Yeah.
and I like to think she would be treated with respect by other women and men in the workplace. And it's just good manners and pragmatic common sense, I think, to behave properly.
Makes a lot of sense. If you've got any thoughts about that particular topic, then give us a call now, 03456060973, because I'm going to be covering that at 9 o'clock for the last hour of the show, because I think it's a very important topic to explore in a bit more detail. Now, the point in the evening which normally instills fear in every cross-question panelist, I think today is actually quite a civilized one that I think it's fine, actually. Tonight, I'm offering you, this is the question, I'm offering you a night out. One exciting event this week. A visit to the newly reopened National Portrait Gallery, which is just next to LBC HQ, by the way, in London, or the Glastonbury Festival, browsing paintings or camping in the rain and heat to see Sir Elton John. Which are you picking and why? Steve?
I'm going to relive my misspent youth and go to Glastonbury, please. I saw the Waterboys singing The Whole of the Moon, and I've not been since, and it would be interesting to see how it's changed.
Fantastic. Stuart?
Well, I'd only go to Glastonbury if it was Dolly Parton. Otherwise, I'm a sucker for great art, so I'd love the National Portrait Gallery.
Fantastic. Matthew?
Well, I normally prefer glamping to camping, but I have to say I would choose Glastonbury because Elton John is playing there this time around. And I have to say, happy Pride, everyone. Happy Pride.
Indeed. Emma?
I saw Elton John at the O2 a couple of weeks ago, so I'll take the National Portrait Gallery. Not least because I'm a fan of indoor plumbing.
You really are the modern Renaissance woman, cultural icon on our panel. What a great panel! What a great discussion! Very enjoyable this evening. Big thanks to Mathew Hulbert from the Lib Dems, Emma Revell from the Centre of Policy Studies, Steve Reid from Labour, and Lord Stewart Jackson from the Tories. A really interesting discussion. Thank you very much for your time and also for all of your questions. Coming up next is going to be that topic that we just talked about. Now, the former chairman of Tesco, who left amid sexual misconduct allegations, has claimed that men are increasingly nervous about working with women. This is John Allen, who left his position at the supermarket in May after being accused of inappropriate remarks and touching, which he denies. And said that he said that there was a growing caution amongst men in the business world. He said a lot of men say to me they're getting increasingly nervous about working with women, mentoring women, something I've done a lot right through my career. So my question to you is this: do we need to be very cautious when interacting with women in the workplace? That's to men, by the way. 034